Hi, this is Jen Rubin, editor-in-chief of The Contrarian. We are delighted to have back a extraordinary litigator and law professor, Mary McCord. Welcome, Mary.
Good to be here.
So the administration has filed a complaint against Judge Boasberg, who has been at the center of one of the biggest controversies and a contempt proceeding regarding the apparent disregard of his order to turn the planes around rather than proceed to CCOT. What is the complaint, and what does it tell us about the administration's stance towards the judiciary?
Well, I think the complaint's pretty extraordinary for a number of reasons. There's just a lot of things in it that are flat out inaccurate. But just in terms of what it is, this is a complaint filed directly with the chief judge of the DC Circuit, and it is against the chief judge of the DC District Court. So grievances with respect to lawyers or with respect to judges can be filed with that DC Circuit chief judge. There is a committee there that things can be transferred to for investigation. And so essentially the administration is filing it with Chief Judge Sri Srinivasan, the chief judge of the DC Circuit, against Chief Judge James Boasberg. And what they ask for ultimately is that this complaint be referred to a special investigative committee that would determine whether Judge Boasberg violated any of the canons of judicial ethics, and they accuse him of violating the canons of judicial ethics. They also ask for him to be taken off the case you just mentioned, Jen, the JGG v. Trump case. This is the original case that started out with emergency hearings over a weekend, March 14th and 15th, when we learned that Venezuelans were being deported or removed from the country and sent to a terrorist detention center in El Salvador based on the alleged authority of the Alien Enemies Act. And then they finally asked for appropriate judicial action, including public reprimand and referral to the Judicial Conference for consideration of impeachment-related recommendations if the committee finds willful misconduct. So this is a full court press against Judge Boasberg.
And what is he accused of doing?
Well,
what is the only basis for this? Bring out the cannons, fire away, hit the nuclear button.
Yeah. So it all stems from a meeting on March 11th, just a few days before that weekend of the removals, at one of the twice yearly sessions of the Judicial Conference of the United States. This is sort of the policy-making arm of the federal judiciary, and it's made up of the Chief Justice, Justice John Roberts, as sort of obviously the head, the chairman, and then the chief judge of each of the circuit courts, so 11 circuits plus DC, and then one judge from a district court within each of those circuits, because DC, of course, is both a district court and a circuit, and no other courts report up to that circuit, but other circuits might have courts in multiple states, right, that report up. So it's a relatively small group, and they meet twice a year. These are not public meetings, contrary to the complaint saying that these were public statements that Judge Boasberg made. These are not public meetings, and what apparently happened is that somebody must have taken some notes or drafted a memo about one part of this meeting. It's been alleged in the Federalist, a different media organization, such as, put those in almost scare quotes, but that this was during a breakfast meeting. Even still, the breakfast meeting is not a public meeting. It's not like anybody can be like, hey, I want to go to the breakfast meeting of the Judicial Conference. And as it's been reported, and as the Department of Justice has now accused Judge Boasberg, what he apparently did was say that some of his colleagues were concerned about whether the administration would follow court orders. And he raised this as a concern that his, fellow judges were having. And the Chief Justice apparently responded, well, along the lines of, well, let's hope that doesn't happen. The president has treated me respectfully so far.
So just to be clear, this was not him saying, I don't think they're going to follow the law. This was saying his colleagues do. And secondly, this was a question addressed to the Chief Justice, who obviously didn't see anything wrong with the question, inappropriate, because he answered it. And didn't admonish Boasberg, didn't halt the proceedings. So what the heck is wrong with asking such a question or reporting on matters that are the purview of the Chief Justice and the federal judiciary?
Yeah. I mean, what he's accused by the Department of Justice, and I say the Department of Justice, I mean, the Attorney General Pam Bondi made it clear that she directed that this complaint be filed. It is signed by one person only. That is her Chief of Staff, Chad Mizell. And the allegation is that this was Judge Boasberg's attempt to, transform what should be just a housekeeping meeting of talking about administrative issues into a forum, and I'm just going to read, a forum to persuade the Chief Justice and other federal judges about his, meaning Judge Boasberg's, preconceived belief that the Trump administration would violate court orders. Now, we can certainly quarrel with that, as you indicated. And again, none of us have seen an actual transcript of this meeting. None of us have heard from Judge Boasberg or the Chief Justice or any other judge who was at the meeting or a staff person who might have been at that meeting. So this all that we know, all that I know so far is from the complaint itself and this story in the Federalist, which said that it was a breakfast meeting and that it was Judge Boasberg not speaking about his own concern, but concerns of his colleagues, to your point. So the idea here is that the allegation is this violated three canons of judicial conduct. One, that a judge should uphold the integrity and independence of the judiciary. I would say that when you're worried about your orders not being followed, that is an effort to uphold the integrity and
Right.
independence of the judiciary. 2A, that a judge should act at all times in a manner that promotes public confidence in the integrity and impartiality of the judiciary. I would say a similar thing in response to that. And 3A6, a judge should not make public comments on the merits of a matter pending or impending in any court. The complaint is riddled with references to this statement being made in public. It was absolutely not made in public. So, basic fact, you wonder, is anybody fact checking anything that is written by Chad Mizell when you read this? There's no indication as well that this was an effort to convince anyone of anything, or to sort of scheme to hold the government in contempt or anything else like that. The other thing I found really striking about the complaint is it says, although his comments would be inappropriate even if they had some basis, they were even worse because Judge Boasberg had no basis. The Trump administration has always complied with all court orders. That is just frankly laughable.
It is. And in fact, the Washington Post documented all the instances in which they had not. We've had federal judges in other
Multiple.
circuits comment again and again that they, number one, doubt the credibility of the government, that they're dismayed. There was just a ruling the other day that the government in the AmeriCorps case had not followed the direction of the court. So not only do we know that this is a concern of other judges, we know it's a true concern.
That's right.
We know it's, if truth is a defense to defamation, this isn't a defamation claim, but if truth is a defense to anything, this is the truth. And it takes a whole lot of gall to file this bit of mess, which, as you say, on its face kind of shows how they operate, which is a complete disregard for the facts.
Mm-hmm.
Are they trying to intimidate Boasberg? Are they trying to intimidate other judges? What could be the possible purpose of this? And I know you can't get inside their heads, but
Yeah.
What does it look like from the outside?
I mean, it certainly looks like that. It looks like retaliation because this is a judge who has been trying to hold the government's feet to the fire, even in the case of JGG, the original, case involving the removal of Venezuelans. Even though the Supreme Court said this can't be brought under the Administrative Procedure Act, it has to be brought in habeas, which the government in its complaint suggests was a total reversal of Judge Boasberg, which it wasn't. It was technical. It was saying this is not the right vehicle, but all 9 justices, this is the case where all 9 justices made clear that people are entitled to due process, notice, notice that they're going to be removed under the Alien Enemies Act, and an opportunity to contest the meaning of the Alien Enemies Act and whether they were members of Tren de Aragua before they're deported. All nine justices agree with that. So, that's another mischaracterization in this complaint, but it can only really be seen to me as sort of retaliation for his continuing to press them to get to the real facts about what happened that day when he ordered the planes to be turned around, and whether that his order was blatantly defied in contempt of court. They want to get him off that case, and they want to keep other judges from doing anything like that, from, in my opinion, from challenging the government on whether the government has complied with court orders, from, trying to seek evidence about that. I mean, to me, this is a shot across the bow, and it's consistent with, remember, they have sued the entire federal bench in the District Court of Maryland. They
Correct.
don't like what those judges were doing. They've actually brought a misconduct complaint against another judge because they didn't like what that judge was doing. So it's hard to see this really as anything other than a way to say, judges, you need to tamp it down because we're going to file misconduct complaints about you.
Right.
Frankly, I feel like this complaint should itself be the basis of a complaint,
It's
because
frivolous. It falls on and on and on. They have violated every canon. Taking a step back, is there also just an element of nihilism here? They constantly lie. They lie in this thing. They constantly violate their own ethical accords. The Senate, God bless them, and I say that in the Southern sense of God bless them, just confirmed Emil Bove, who has had multiple whistleblowers come forward to credibly accuse him of impropriety and then misrepresenting what he did under oath to the Senate. It's almost as if they're so bad, they want to smear it around and say, well, this is just the new standard. Everyone behaves like this. Everyone accuses people of all kinds of things. Everyone fudges the fact, and therefore we're not worse than anybody else. And it's kind of this malicious, defining deviance down. Is that part of what is going on here potentially?
So that's an interesting thing to sort of like say out loud, right? But it is certainly consistent with some of the things that the government has represented. In fact, in this complaint, they accused Judge Boasberg of ignoring the presumption of regularity, right? The presumption that government actors and government officials will comply with the law. And again, that's kind of one of those almost laughable things. It's like, well, wait a minute, this is a government and a Department of Justice who's not been doing things according to the presumption of regularity. In fact, we've had a different judge say in open court, you're basically completely undoing the presumption of regularity, meaning I can't look at you as a government official and just trust that what you have done is normal, because so much has not been normal. So I don't know. I think it's interesting how you described it. In a way, it's almost like they just want to put a label on something and saying what we're doing is normal when we
Yes.
know it's not. And I guess that's your point. Are they just trying to define a new normal? And of course, in the government's view, at least in a number of examples we've seen, this notion of, the previous administration weaponized the Department of Justice, and we need to fix that. Well, they're to their minds fixing it by weaponizing the Department of Justice. And there's just no way. Is there, under every administration, there are certainly times when the executive pushes an envelope on something, right? And sometimes a court reverses, and that is a court's, or not reverses, but overrules that. And that's the court's job. But like, this is just such a flood of repeat that it does seem to be trying to kind of create a new normal. And so far, the district judges just really aren't having that. And that's
Right.
district judges appointed by Republicans, Democrats, Trump appointed judges. I mean, they are one of the co-equal branches of government, and it's their job pursuant to the Constitution to say what the law is. And so, I do think it's just, it's disappointing. And, I do a podcast with Andrew Weissman, and we just yesterday talked about how it's just an unrecognizable Department
Yes.
of Justice. I mean, having
Exactly.
spent, over 2 decades there, this is just not the department that I grew
Right.
up in.
This also comes, if you remember, after the Chief Justice of the United States admonished Trump for threatening, or other Republicans threatening, to impeach judges, making the comment that if you don't like a ruling, excuse me, you don't threaten judges, rather you appeal it. And for a moment there, I thought he was actually going to do his job as the head of the judiciary. He is the Chief Justice, but as we point out in this conference setting and in other settings, he sits atop the federal judiciary. Doesn't he have a responsibility, particularly because he was involved in this event, to say something, to do something, to comment on this? I mean, is he just going to let his judges, and I say that loosely, they don't necessarily work for him, but the judges that are part of the branch of government he serves, take this kind of stuff? Where is he?
So, I don't think he would comment on this specifically because now there has been a complaint filed, right? And that would essentially be, the Chief Justice commenting on a pending complaint. And that is something that in itself could be the subject of criticism. But
Yeah.
he could certainly comment more broadly, like he did before, right? About
Yes.
threats to judges, retaliation against judges, that there are, mechanisms in our law that provide for what you do when you are unhappy with the ruling. And certainly, there are judges that do commit ethical violations, and there is a procedure for filing those types of, misconduct allegations. And, I wouldn't think he would ever suggest that you can't use that procedure. The problem here is they're using that procedure and it's a factually inaccurate, just blatantly wrong in many respects, particularly things that are easily verifiable, like this is not a public proceeding or a public meeting. And so, I think there are things he could make another broad statement, and I hope that he will. I don't think he'll speak specifically to this incident. I also don't think this is going to go anywhere. I mean, it could be that Chief Judge Srinivasan will say, okay, I'll refer it to a committee so that we've engaged in an ordinary process. I mean, he would be justified to dismiss it outright, but he might want to go through process. But there's just no there, because even if you take away the inaccuracies and accept the allegation, there's just nothing that violates any of the canons that are mentioned there. There's nothing about saying in a context. Now, granted, this was a few days before the failure to turn the planes around, so it hadn't happened yet in Judge Boasberg's courtroom, but there'd already been other instances. Remember, early on, it seems like forever ago, there was, the halting of foreign aid and a judge who ruled you need to turn the spigot back on, and the spigot didn't get turned back on right away. Like, so there had already been instances of defiance by the time that Judge Boasberg said this, and since then there have been many, many more. And if you're thinking about the Judicial Conference being the policy and administrative body who is meeting to talk about issues that permeate the judiciary and things they might want to recommend legislation to Congress on, it's a completely valid thing to say. We have concerns the government might not be abiding by judicial orders. I mean, Congress could create new statutes that apply to that, for example.
Right. And by the way, I am reminded by one Justice Alito, who, with no basis whatsoever during the Biden administration in the issue involving an appeal, and the procedure was a little complicated, about the drug medication that is used in abortions, made a slam at the administration that we can't even accept or predict that they would abide by this ruling out of nowhere, in an administration that had never done anything else. Now, the Biden administration just kind of took it and went on and their merry way. But if there is anyone who has been accusing the government of misconduct with no basis in fact whatsoever, it's Justice Alito. And of course, nothing transpired. I want to kind of pull back and end on this. We have a Justice Department and a Attorney General that has gone so rogue, that has behaved in so many inappropriate ways. Is there ultimately, for her, a day when she will be held accountable. Impeachment doesn't really work. She could be brought up on bar charges, either in Florida, I suppose, or here. That's pretty weak tea. But I think you got to go back to those senators who confirmed this person and who confirmed people like Emil Bove. They can be held responsible. What about the judges? What do you recommend other than severe judicial reform that we do about people who behave in inappropriate ways, and a Justice Department that has now broken every norm, every ethical precept in the book?
So this is where it gets so tricky, right? Because I think partly the reason that, our structure has survived for almost 250 years is because the people within the three branches of government had a couple of things. They wanted it to survive, so they wanted to preserve the checks and balances and separation of powers that are built into the constitutional scheme, even if they didn't like them always, or even if technically they could try to kind of like maneuver around them. They had respect for it, and that's why there was respect. Not every single president and every single attorney general at every moment, but for norms, things that are not laws, but are norms that preserve that balance between the three branches. And people did not want to be the subject of a judicial complaint or a
Right.
bar complaint. They didn't want to be subject to contempt. They didn't want to even have their names associated with the potential for impeachment. And so we've seen how like vulnerable the system is when people don't care about that, when they're just going to
Exactly. And they
say,
don't care.
that's what the other side did, now we're doing it, whether it's based in fact or not. And when you've captured the Congress the way this administration has right now, then those political tools like impeachment are probably not available so long as the Congress remains beholden to the president. And, bar complaints can result in people being disbarred. Rudy Giuliani's been disbarred, John Eastman, right? Like some people who were very, very involved in the misfeasance of the first administration, particularly with respect to the 2020 election. And that can really, harm your ability to do your profession, both as the attorney general and subsequent to being attorney general. You can even, have complaints against judges that, like we see from this complaint, could result in some types of censure or action. But, like you say, those they're not non-existent, but it's not necessarily the kind of accountability we would think through. And I think that's one reason why 2026 is so important, right? Because like you said,
Absolutely.
the
Absolutely.
particularly on the Senate side, those who have confirmed these nominees when there was so much evidence. And with Bove, it is so troubling because everything we've just been talking about with respect to Judge Boasberg and that emergency hearing where he ordered no one to be deported without due process and the planes to turn around. We now know from the whistleblowers, or at least as alleged from the whistleblowers, that has not been actually denied by Bove. I think he just says he didn't recall, or that he never would have said that, but according to whistleblowers, he said, we might have, and I'm going to say this more politely, we may have to devise some court orders.
Right.
So what's shocking to me, besides all the norms and everything else I've said, is Congress is its own branch of government. And wouldn't
Yes.
you think, out of pure self-interest, that they would care about preserving their authority under the Constitution, their advice and consent authority, their oversight authority, but they just keep rolling over. And all you can say is because they're just too afraid of retaliation. They're afraid it'll come back to get them at the ballot box if Trump, goes against them. I think they also are personally fearful for their safety and the safety of their families, because when Trump turns on somebody and says public things about them, those people and their families get threats of violence.
Yes.
And so this is not a healthy way for our democracy to be right now.
Absolutely. And I'll end with three observations. One, this Supreme Court has empowered this president and everything he has done, starting with even before, but most clearly with the broad criminal immunity. And although it's not at issue here, that has supercharged this quest for unlimited power, the sense that they are above the law, they don't need to follow the rules, and they expressly say that we will abide by the Supreme Court's ruling, as if lower court judges do not have the power of the law, which is nonsense. Of course they do. You have to follow the law until it's appealed, a ruling until it's appealed. I will say number two, you're exactly right. The Senate has completely fallen apart. Those people have been irresponsible to the hilt. And the third is that this can be fixed to some extent. It's going to be very hard to reconstruct a Justice Department that actually functions. It's going to be hard to have follow-up, although you could still investigate an Emil Bove. You theoretically could have impeachment hearings if he lied under oath, but it's going to be very hard. And I think the extent of the damage to our system cannot be exaggerated. It is immense. And I will come back, final words, with this unbelievable mistake in judgment, and that was Merrick Garland not understanding what he was dealing with, thinking he didn't want to politicize the Justice Department by pressing fast against this president who had instigated an insurrection. And the result was he was never held criminally responsible, and the entire Justice Department is now a hunking, smoking ruin. So thanks, Merrick Garland. So
That's a lot on his shoulders, but I take your point. Yes.
All right. Well, listen, Mary, it is always great chatting with you. You're always illuminating the darkness, and I'm sure we're going to come back to you in this very trying, very challenging times. So we'll look forward to next time. Thanks so much.
Thanks for having me.